Welcome to Crossroads. The United States is facing a serious security threat that has been brewing for decades. Now, the Chinese Communist Party and Russia are pushing into the Arctic, and there are concerns they could work to militarize it, which would give them an easier attack point to the United States if a war were to take place. If you've ever flew, for example, to Asia, you'll know that you fly over northern Canada, because that is the invasion route were a war to happen. Now, the Pentagon has issued a new strategy on how to face this threat and could soon begin pushing into the Arctic as well, aided interestingly by NATO allies, which would be a shift in theater for NATO and also the introduction of a NATO operation mainly aimed at the Chinese Communist Party. They would also be developing new defensive technologies within the Arctic. Now, this comes on the heels of what may seem like a strange encounter. The Coast Guard on July 10th said this: "The U.S. Coast Guard encountered multiple People's Republic of China (CCP) military ships in the Bering Sea Saturday and Sunday." And it said all four of the People's Republic of China vessels were transitioning in international waters, but still inside the U.S. exclusive economic zone, which extends 200 nautical miles from the U.S. shoreline. The Chinese vessels responded to U.S. Coast Guard radio communication and stated their purpose was, quote, freedom of navigation operations, which I'll explain in a minute. Now, it notes as well the Coast Guard, in coordination with U.S. Northern Command, was fully aware of and tracked the Chinese naval presence. And also in September of 2021 and 2022, Coast Guard cutters deployed in the Bering Sea also encountered Chinese surface action groups. So, look, in one sense, that encounter could be seen as like tit for tat. Freedom of navigation operations are what the U.S. calls naval operations that challenge the Chinese Communist Party's claims to the South China Sea. You know, when they say freedom of navigation operations, essentially it's this: the CCP has tried to establish a security zone around the entire South China Sea. They want to make it so that if airplanes, including commercial airlines, fly through the region, they have to call into China and ask permission. Also the same thing with ships, fishing boats, military ships from other countries, the whole 9 yards. The CCP claims it owns the entire area and wants everybody to go through it for permission to go through the area. And it's within that as well they claim ownership of Taiwan. Now, of course, when the US and Japan and other countries go through that region, they call that freedom of navigation operations. They are openly violating the Chinese Communist Party's claims and contesting it. Now, of course, the CCP doesn't have any legal claims to it. In fact, international courts have determined otherwise, determining again that the Chinese Communist Party does not legally own the overwhelming majority of that area. But again, the CCP has maintained those claims regardless of legal determination. But look, on the Chinese ships near Alaska, it's a bit different. These operations may go beyond just the CCP trying to create perceived equivalence, right? Because the CCP is trying to say, well, you go through our territory, we'll go through yours. You can't really say it's too much the same because, of course, the United States does actually legally own that stuff in terms of basic international law, unlike the CCP's claim to the South China Sea. But these operations, again, near Alaska of the CCP, they seem to be also tied to the CCP's ambitions for the Arctic. And that's kind of the big picture here. That encounter, the recent one, that took place right as defense news reports were coming out saying the United States was planning to announce a military strategy for the Arctic. And the Pentagon has now officially released that strategy. This is the Department of Defense. It says the Defense Department today released its 2024 Arctic strategy. It says the strategy acknowledges how environmental changes are affecting the Arctic region, details the implications for U.S. security, and spells out how the department plans to be ready to meet new challenges there. It notes further in that 8 nations have a presence in the Arctic, including Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and the United States and Russia. All have interests there for both commerce and security. Again, we look at the map oftentimes. If you look at a printed out map on your wall or something, we see it as just right to left and it's just printed out. But actually, the northern area around the Arctic is also a region in and of itself. And you also have countries with various claims to the Arctic region and also security operations up there because, again, it's an important region both for commerce and oil and minerals, but also especially for military operations. Now, they also very specifically point out the threat of the Chinese Communist Party in the Arctic region. They say the People's Republic of China, not an Arctic nation, in fact, they have to infringe on Russian territory to get there, is increasing its presence in the Arctic. And notes the People's Republic of China, the PRC, operates 3 icebreakers in the Arctic, for instance, and has a military presence there as well. The Chinese military has also demonstrated its ability to operate in the Arctic by conducting operations with the Russian Navy, for instance. Now, that's important because, again, if there ever were a war to happen with Russia or China, it would probably not happen in, Guam and Hawaii. It would happen in Alaska and northern Canada. And of course, already when Russia does air incursions, they typically do it within Canadian airspace because that is the easy route. Now, here's what Deputy Defense Secretary Kathleen Hicks had to say about this whole thing during a briefing at the Pentagon. Watch this.
Our Arctic strategy adopts a monitor and respond approach in the region. It is underpinned by robust domain awareness and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, cooperation with our allies and partners, and deterrent power enabled by the agility of the joint force. The strategy focuses on enhancing our domain awareness and Arctic capabilities, engaging with our allies and partners, and exercising calibrated presence in the region.
So basically what this means is that the United States will now start working on new defense operations in the Arctic. And the United States will also start working with its allies to help secure the Arctic against the operations both of the Chinese Communist Party and of Russia. Now, on this note, the Pentagon is warning that there are some very real threats relating to the Arctic, again on this front. The Pentagon is pointing out that the Chinese Communist Party is playing a long game to increase its influence within the Arctic region. And that's despite them not being an Arctic nation. Watch.
While not an Arctic state, the PRC seeks greater influence in the region, greater access to the region, and a greater say in its governance. That's concerning, given that it's the only strategic competitor with the will and increasingly the wherewithal to remake the international order. That's why you hear us refer to the PRC as our pacing challenge.
Now, here's a few key points from the official strategy that was released by the Pentagon. This is the, 2024 Arctic Strategy. It says the PRC, again, Chinese Communist Party, includes the Arctic in its long-term planning and seeks to increase its influence and activities in the region, though not an Arctic nation. No legal claims to the area, in other words. It says the PRC is attempting to leverage changing dynamics in the Arctic to pursue greater influence and access, take advantage of Arctic resources, and play a larger role in regional governance. They note that although the vast majority of the Arctic is under the jurisdiction of sovereign states, the CCP, the PRC, seeks to promote the Arctic region as a global commons in order to shift Arctic governance in its favor, saying, hey, it doesn't belong to anybody, it belongs to the whole world. But by doing that, the CCP plans, of course, to take it for itself, at least many parts of it. Now, look, as I mentioned, it's not just the Chinese Communist Party trying to increase its influence in the region either. Russia is also pushing more heavily into the Arctic as well. But I'll be talking more about these threats and the real agenda behind it after we come back from a quick break.
Experts agree. One of the best ways to protect against financial uncertainty is to diversify your portfolio. Learn how physical gold and silver can secure your retirement funds from today's economic challenges with a gold IRA from American Hartford Gold. You can safeguard your wealth with no penalties or taxes when you transfer your current qualifying retirement accounts. Call now and our precious metals specialists will send you a free information kit, no cost or obligation. American Hartford Gold, a trusted industry leader with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau, has a 5-star rating from thousands of happy clients. Whether you are getting physical precious metals in a gold IRA or delivered to your doorstep, we offer only the highest quality gold and silver. For your peace of mind, we also offer a no-fee buyback commitment, a low-price guarantee, along with free shipping and free insurance. So don't wait. Call the number on your screen today and secure your financial future.
Welcome back. The United States has officially released its 2024 Arctic strategy, pointing to new threats from the Chinese Communist Party and from Russia trying to get into the region. Now, on this note, the security threat has been brewing for years, in fact, decades. And there are now concerns that the CCP and Russia could militarize the Arctic as an attack point if a war were to take place against the United States. Now, like as I mentioned, it's not just the Chinese Communist Party just doing this, it's also Russia. They're trying to push more heavily into the Arctic region. Watch.
At the same time, Russia continues to pose an acute threat to security and stability in the region. Despite its losses in Ukraine, Russia has continued to build up its military infrastructure in the Arctic and assert excessive claims over Arctic waters. Russia's ongoing illegal war in Ukraine has rendered government-to-government cooperation on Arctic matters virtually impossible.
Now here's more on Russia's push into the Arctic from the Pentagon strategy. This is again the 2024 Arctic strategy from the Department of Defense. It says the Arctic plays a significant role in Russia's security and economic calculations. This importance, it says, is reflected in Russia's strategic documents, including Russia's 2023 foreign policy concept, which raises the Arctic to Russia's second priority region after Russia's near abroad. Think Ukraine, for example. So, of course, Ukraine and the near abroad being one focus of Russia, the European theater, but the Arctic being the second biggest priority for Russia. And why is that? Well, it's because, again, the Arctic will be the staging ground in a war were something to happen with the United States. Now, note that Russia boasts the largest Arctic territory and the most developed regional military presence of all the Arctic nations. Of concern, it says, Russia's Arctic capabilities have the potential to hold the U.S. homeland as well as allied and partner territory at risk. Again, because that's the staging ground for such a conflict. It says the Kola Peninsula is home to Russia's Northern Fleet and important strategic nuclear forces, specifically its submarine-launched ballistic missile force. Further in, it states that Russia also has a clear avenue of approach to the U.S. homeland through the Arctic and could use its Arctic-based capabilities to threaten the ability of the United States to project power both to Europe and the Indo-Pacific region, constraining our ability to respond to crisis. Now and then, there's also problems of the increasing joint activities between the Chinese Communist Party and Russia in the Arctic.
More troubling, we've seen growing cooperation between the PRC and Russia in the Arctic. Commercially, with the PRC being a major funder of Russian energy exploitation in the Arctic, and increasingly militarily, with Russia and China conducting joint exercises off the coast of Alaska.
Now, given this, right, under this new strategy, the United States and its allies are going to be working together in the Arctic. And this is important because this means the United States, its NATO allies, which normally focus just in Northern Europe, and possibly other countries, will now be tangibly working together, not just against Russia, but also against the Chinese Communist Party. Now remember, for NATO, that's a big jump. NATO is the North Atlantic, defense kind of treaty between the U.S. and allies in Europe. They're mostly focused as a regional power. For them to go to East Asia and, of course, challenge the Chinese Communist Party, that's a jump, and it's something outside the maybe more conventional view of what their role is going to be. They're, of course, focusing more on China now because they view China as the enabling factor of Russia's war in Ukraine, which is, of course, affecting their security region. But if they begin working in the Arctic, and they begin, of course, not flying over to East Asia to again challenge the CCP, this is something within their region. This is something where they could stage operations. And this is an area where they, again, will be challenging not just Russia, but also the CCP. Now, it also notes that Finland and Sweden, they recently joined NATO. And they play an important role with this because, again, they're Arctic powers. And this will also mean the United States, again, will start building more defensive infrastructure, surveillance technologies, and sensors both on land and in space. They're even talking about, for example, special operations forces, operations within the Arctic and other things of that sort. Now, on the notes of the sensors, though, this is important because the sensors are one of the big things that the United States used to contain Russia during the time of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This could very likely be similar to what's called the Sound Surveillance System. That's called SOSUS. The United States used that to detect Soviet submarines during the Cold War. Essentially what they did was they put underwater sensors throughout the regions where Russia had its ports. And that made it so that if Russian submarines left their ports, the United States knew exactly where they were. The Arctic now is a region very similar to that, and of course the Arctic is a region we don't currently have, at least as far as we know, a whole lot of those kinds of technologies. And so if the US used both satellites and of course ground-based sensors, and who knows, maybe they'll do underwater ones too, that would work as early warning systems for any kind of missile launch or incursion through airspace using jets or anything of that sort. That would mean that an invasion or missile launch or anything else would be detectable within the Arctic region. And of course, were a war to take place, it would also mean that the US would know where enemy forces are, as well as, of course, NATO allies knowing this. And as might be expected, well, the Chinese Communist Party and Russia, they're very critical of this new announcement. CBS said that Russia and China on Tuesday pushed back against a US warning over their increasing military and economic cooperation in the Arctic, where climate change, they say, is opening up greater competition because they say the ice is melting. And if it melts all the way, which they claim it will, that means, of course, the whole area is up for grabs, essentially. And notes the two autocratic countries, which 2 years ago suggested they were working together to offer a new democratic world order. Again, read the multipolar world order that we've been talking about. It says they pledged in a joint statement signed in May when Russian President Vladimir Putin visited his counterpart Xi Jinping in Beijing to consider together the negative impact of the US and NATO's strategy in the Asia-Pacific. And remember now, it's not just the Asia-Pacific, now it's also the European theater with Ukraine, and now it's going to be the Arctic theater. And aside from military operations, one of the big things that Russia is pushing for in the Arctic is the establishment of a northern sea route for shipping, which also means militarizing it as well. And as this happens, the Chinese Communist Party is also pushing for more control over the other side of the world, in the Antarctic. They want to become a polar power. We'll be talking more about Russia and China's ambitions and plans exclusively on EpochTV.com, the uncensored streaming platform of the Epoch Times. So if you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, X, Rumble, there's a link in the description below. You can click on that, get access to the rest of this episode. And not only will you get my whole library of shows, you'll also get family-friendly movies, premium investigative reports, and hard-hitting documentaries on issues that matter, like the Chinese Communist Party's 100-year plan to defeat the United States, which I expose in my documentary, The Final War. The CCP is one of the biggest threats to America. They're using things like video games, entertainment, movies, culture to subvert and influence the next generation. And this unrestricted war against our country is one of the scariest but least understood issues of our time, because it's not tangible. There's no tanks or bombs. It's being done through soft power and ideological subversion. I spent over a decade investigating the CCP's subversion, and it's such an important issue that I've dedicated my career to warning people about the threats of the CCP. If you'd like to find out what exactly the CCP is plotting against America, then watch The Final War. You can find the link in the description below, and I'll show you all the trailer before we go exclusively to EpochTV.com for the rest of this episode. I'll see you all there.
The greatest threat facing the United States is the CCP.
The Epoch Times investigation team had studied the CCP for years, but what we uncovered was yielding evidence beyond our imagination.
With Chairman Mao, with the Prime Minister, our talks have been characterized by frankness.
The Clinton administration said, "Oh, don't worry about it. This will be a poison pill for China."
China's strategic goal is to make sure that the U.S. has 4 enemies, and one of them must be a terrorist group.
We are giving of our life's blood so that the Chinese Communist Party can survive and thrive.